The delays in the UK COVID response is to blame for the roller coaster of lockdowns, the inquiry has been told. I'm going to read into this more from Open Democracy, guys. Let's go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is REGANELITE here with another article from Open Democracy with the headline that delays in the UK's COVID response is to blame for the rollercoaster of lockdowns, the inquiry is told. Slower interventions to curb the spread of coronavirus has led to more stringent measures for longer, says Thomas Hale. To be honest, before we even read into this, I think it makes sense that the delays in the lockdowns did cost lives. Most of our understanding of it is that due to those delays and the decisions made by the British government at the time under Boris Johnson, there was, in my opinion, and perhaps in your opinion, some of you may differ, that there was a severe lack of a response to this global pandemic that was taking place. I think the real alarm bells for me personally was when it hit Italy and how it hit Italy, and the media when it was covering it in Italy. The alarm bell should have been ringing so much more louder then than when it first started off in China. And when the first cases arrived in the UK, it took way too long before Britain finally decided to lock down. There had even been reports of cases, I think even in Christmas, 1 or 2 cases in Christmas in the UK before it even really landed. I don't know how true that was back in 2020, but it was nonetheless, in my opinion, the government's attitude, I think, was to be into question. And we've said it before and we'll say it again. Needless lives were lost as a result of the actions by the British government. That's not to say that there were things that they did eventually lock down the country for the sake of it, and people to this day still question whether locking down the country was the right thing to do. And that's what this inquiry is about, to find out whether everything we've done up to this point was everything that could have been done, needed to be done to protect people's lives. And I think this inquiry is really important. But whether there'll be any kind of criminality or justice, I'm not expecting that, sadly. The UK government's delay in introducing COVID interventions and a lack of an effort contact tracing programme led to more severe restrictions than in other countries, the UK COVID inquiry has heard. Countries such as Japan, South Korea and Vietnam were able to use testing and tracing measures to maintain low levels and spread and outbreak of COVID-19, said Thomas Hale, leader of the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker, which monitored how 185 countries responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Keeping the virus at a lower level meant that these countries were able to avoid more stringent measures required to deal with more widespread infections, the professor added. Effective use of these testing measures was a nice way of maintaining a low level of spread, and therefore not the beginning the rise of the roller coaster, said Hade, referring to the trend in some countries, including the UK, to implement strict measures and ease them between waves and reintroduce them later. Yeah, so the countries over in Asia pretty much, locked everything down, and some of those nations have had those kind of outbreak, have, to all intents and purposes, have had those outbreaks. And those culture and the people and the cultures over there, they are used to wearing a mask, ensuring that and that there is a much more degree of trust, I would say, in their governments, much more than Western leaders. That is for sure. So, and when there are serious issues taking place, the people do listen to their nations there, albeit democratic or whatever their nations may be over on that part of the world. But you could agree to disagree with me, but I've never set foot over there. But I'm basing it on the knowledge of what I've learned, of what I've read, and what people have said about that. Countries riding the roller coaster were suffering from a trifecta of large health impacts, long periods of stringency, and negative economic consequences, said Hale. Those were able to maintain a low spread, perhaps thought effective test and trace and isolation measures, were able to have a better outcome on all three of those measures. Asking whether the UK government response to the pandemic resembled a roller coaster, Chief Counsel to the inquiry Hugo Keith KC made particular reference to the government's decision to close schools and workplaces in a more severe move than any other countries early in the pandemic, before dropping to a low comprehensive level of restrictions between waves. Hay said that the UK's roller coaster tendency could be seen in both the delay to introduce restrictions and the increased stringency of those restrictions because they were too late. Sustaining high stringency for long periods comes at a cost. There's huge pressure to roll them restrictions back sooner rather than later, and that leads inevitably some visual virus circulating the population and lays the seeds for the next week to emerge, says Hay. The government's response tracker began in spring 2020, when the most prominent government responses to the pandemic were so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, such as travel restrictions or requirements to stay at home, with vaccinations coming online later. In broad terms, Hale said the literature he and his team reviewed suggesting that interventions such as masks, schools and workplace closures and other restrictions preventing people from meeting one another are going to be ones that have the greatest impact on cases, hospitalisations and eventually deaths. The hearing showed a chart comparing the introduction of NPIs or lockdown measures in different countries that had identified 100 COVID cases. It showed very clearly that in relation to the spread of the virus, restrictive measures in the UK came into place much more slowly than any other group of comparable countries, said Hay, referring to the region, for example, of similar political systems or populations. Elderly care and working with homes NPIs were the only two interventions where the UK was in line with comparable comprehensive countries in terms of what they're introducing measures. The tracker team collabed and reviewed thousands of studies and data related to the actions taken by the government around the world in response to the pandemic. The review conducted that the speed and strength of intervention matters in terms of the spread of the virus, health impacts, and the cost of managing a disease outbreak. I don't think anyone here is going to argue that point. Effective use of test, trace, and isolate measures limits health impact, and the need for more stringent measures to be introduced. Again, I don't think anyone's going to argue that. Economic support can bolster compliance with intervention or restriction. Yeah, because people still got to put food on their plates and still got payments to make. Prolonged restriction can have economic and other costs. Well, we knew that from all nations around the world suffered economic damage as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't think anyone can argue that one. Rapid introduction of intervention when faced with diseases such as COVID-19 are critical to reducing further spread, said Hay. One study suggested that a single day's delay in implementing restrictions such as a ban on mass gatherings during the wave of the virus may have led to a 7% increase in the culmination death toll. There was, I think, before things got really bad, there was a football match, a Champions League football match that took place in Liverpool at their Liverpool Football Club. They hosted I don't know if it was I think it was in Liverpool. I don't think it was in Spain. A Champions League match, European match against Spanish club Atletico Madrid. Now, obviously, as things started to really build up, this was a very bad time to be going ahead with a match like that, especially when people are travelling and it is starting to really start running wild. There were already questions about whether that match should have even taken place or gone ahead because of the large gathering in it. Another one was I think it was the Grand National. I think it was one of the horse races. Grand Nationals went ahead as well, and it was large crowd gatherings as well, and that was also put into question. So it wasn't until we got really close to lockdowns that everything kind of stopped. But at the time when those were read in the papers and that the questions were being asked, that when the leading scientists were saying not to avoid large gatherings, and there were large gatherings happening, it was a complete well, why are you guys saying avoid large gatherings when the government are clearly still allowing large gatherings to happen? So, Hayes said the data and studies showed evidence on the cost of prolonged restrictions to mental health, learning outcomes for children and domestic violence last week. The inquiry heard about the dramatic increase in calls and referrals to a leading domestic violence charity during the pandemic. On average, the data reviewed by the Tracker Project suggests that more stringent restrictions on international travel were associated with reductions of the spread of COVID-19, he said. Less stringent measures, such as temperature checks at borders, were harder to enforce and did not show the same impact on transmission rates as stricter interventions, such as long quarantines in hotels and arrival and border closures, Hale added under questioning. The quarantines in hotels, that's brutal. That's really brutal for people to be having to sit there and be stuck in hotels and rooms while they wait for a week or 2 weeks or whatever just to confirm that they haven't got COVID-19 and that really sucked. As a wrestling fan, I knew some wrestlers over in Japan because they were so strict with things over there, and they basically just had to sit in the hotels and couldn't do nothing. They couldn't even leave the hotel, or food was brought to them or whatever. And people travelling anywhere, most countries out there, they were going through the same thing. It is brutal to be trapped in a box for so long. That's rough. He referred interventions were aimed at bolstering compliance with COVID measures such as other countries, including in India, where food was provided to those isolating. Early in the evidence session, Kalmish Kunti, apologies for mispronunciation of the name, a professor who sat on the government scientific advisory group for emergencies, that's SAGE, said ethnically subgroup made recommendations about the support for Bangladesh and Pakistani communities disproportionately affected by the virus, including housing provision, to help those in multi-generational households to isolate. He was not asked whether any of these recommendations were taken up. Why were they not recommended? Why not? Witness Mark Walpert, a former government's chief scientific advisor, later stressed that his evidence was non-pharmaceutical interventions work best in combination. For example, test, trace and isolate along vaccinations. Social and cultural factors could also inform their effectiveness. For example, the preparedness of the South Korean government and public for a pandemic followed its experience of the MERS outbreak in 2025. Asked whether the UK would be able to introduce a better test and trace system today, Walpert said the UK's position was not as strong as we would like to be. I think there is much more to do, he said. The disinvestment in public health, not just in the UK but in rich countries around the world, needs to be tackled. The inquiry continues. Yes, of course, the inquiry continues. Some worrying thoughts there about the handling of this all. But yes, as I've mentioned in a few of them, and I'll mention them again here, there were actions and that the government could have done, the British government could have done to stop this, to stop the loss of life. I think Thomas Hale's assessment here speaks kind of truth to power. A lot of it makes a lot of sense in terms of what other scientists and what other advisors you've heard during the lockdowns at those times. What we're hearing, the vast majority of people were saying that things should have been done quicker and things should have been done sooner. Could not have been more true. And I just think that when this inquiry does end, it is going to be quite damning on the government. I do think so. But as I said in the intro, I just don't think justice is going to come. But I think it's important that we try and get every single ounce of information about the COVID-19 inquiry that we could possibly can, for the benefit of not just those who were victims and those who have suffered and have lost loved ones, but for everyone, so that we can learn better. Because this current government have no intention of learning better, but I'm sure the Labour Party will look at this if they go into government in the next general election and take necessary actions to ensure that if a pandemic does come while they're in power, they will make sure they have everything necessary and prepped for it. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think so far of the COVID-19 inquiry. What do you make of Thomas Hale's points there in the inquiry so far? What are your honest opinions so far on this? Maybe should we have done lockdown earlier? Do you think what the government did was the right call at the time? Let me know. Like, share, and subscribe as always. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to catch you all very, very soon.